Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You ever walk into a room and feel like the air tightens around your throat before you've even said a word? That's what it's like every damn time I show up to a family gathering. Doesn't matter how long it's been, doesn't matter how old I get, there's always that unspoken ranking system humming underneath the surface like a bad electrical wire, and somehow I'm always stuck at the bottom. Not even at the bottom, really, more like pushed off the list entirely. Like I don't even register on the scoreboard. My name's Claire. I'm 42, divorced, no kids, living alone in a modest townhouse with a cat who tolerates me when she's hungry. I work full-time in a corporate office, senior administrative analyst, though if you ask my mother, she'd probably say I'm doing paperwork or something. That's the tone she uses when she talks about me, flat, dismissive, like I'm a side dish no one ordered, but she's too polite to throw out. Then there's my brother, Ryan. 5 years younger, flashy smile, real estate agent of the damn decade, apparently. Drives a leased Audi, shows up in fitted shirts that scream commission check, and has this effortless way of making everyone think he's the main character in the room. My mom eats it up like it's gospel. Ryan could sell a moldy trailer to a blind man, and she'd still brag that he's really making moves in the market. I don't hate him. Not really. But you spend enough years being compared to someone who walks into every room with a spotlight trailing behind him while you're left fumbling in the shadows, and yeah, it builds a certain kind of pressure inside you. The kind that hums under your ribs, waiting for a crack in the dam. The annual family reunion was coming up, one of those backyard barbecues where everyone pretends they've missed each other more than they actually have. My parents host it every July. Burgers, beer, paper plates, loud music, awkward hugs, and someone always ends up drunk enough to start dancing badly before the sun sets. I've skipped a few years here and there, usually citing work or migraines, but this year my dad called and asked if I'd be there. He never asks. He just assumes. But this time, his voice was softer, almost tentative, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. At work, things had actually been going pretty well, better than I'd let on to anyone. My new department lead had quit abruptly a few months ago, and since then I'd stepped in, unofficially handling everything from project oversight to budget negotiations. It wasn't part of my job description, but I did it anyway. Not for praise, just because I knew I could, and honestly, no one else seemed capable of holding the place together without panicking over spreadsheets. Mark Donovan, my boss, had noticed. He's a tall, broad-shouldered guy with the kind of calm voice that can make chaos sound manageable. We'd worked together for 6 years, but lately, he'd been looped into more meetings with me, asking for my input on things higher up the food chain. One day, after a long budget meeting, he'd leaned on my cubicle wall and said, "You've basically been running this place behind the curtain, Claire." I didn't know what to say, so I just laughed it off, but something about the way he said it stuck with me. A week before the reunion, I ran into him in the break room, and we got to talking about weekend plans. I mentioned the barbecue in that way people do when they don't want to talk about it too much, hoping the subject shifts to anything else. But Mark seemed genuinely curious, especially when I mentioned the neighborhood and realized he'd just bought a house a few blocks away. He smiled and said, "Maybe I'll swing by, always up for free food and meeting the people behind the faces." I chuckled and waved him off, assuming he was just being polite. I didn't take it seriously. I figured, hell, even if he did drive by, he'd probably turn around once he saw the chaos in our backyard. The day of the reunion came hotter than hell. I got there early to help set up, of course I did, because Ryan wouldn't lift a finger if it didn't involve a camera or a crowd. My mom barked orders, my aunt rolled in potato salad, and my uncle kept talking about his latest surgery like it was a damn badge of honor. Classic family reunion behavior. Ryan pulled into the driveway half an hour late, sunglasses on, smiling like a politician. People actually clapped. I wish I were joking. I stayed mostly in the background, grilling, bringing out drinks, trying to keep my mouth shut and avoid the inevitable passive-aggressive jabs. But then, maybe 45 minutes into the gathering, I noticed a familiar car pulling up down the street. My breath hitched. It was Mark. Not just passing by, he parked, stepped out in a crisp button-up, holding a bottle of wine like he belonged there, and started walking toward the yard with that same calm, steady grin he always wore. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hands were still covered in burger grease and charcoal dust, and there he was, my boss, my colleague, the only person at work who saw me for who I really was. Now casually strolling into the lion's den without even knowing what kind of circus he'd just walked into. And just like that, the entire energy shifted. Because while I was still the ghost daughter to my family, Mark was about to become the mirror they never expected to face. There's something almost cruel in how predictable these reunions have become. Same paper plates, same cheap red cups, same tired jokes recycled year after year like they're some sort of family heirloom worth preserving. The backyard was already full by the time the first round of burgers hit the grill, and the speakers were pumping out an old playlist that hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. People stood around clutching drinks, smiling through their teeth, nodding at stories they'd heard a dozen times before. You could practically smell the forced nostalgia in the air, thick and cloying, like overcooked coleslaw on a hot day. I was already regretting showing up, and that was before the backhanded compliments even started flying. It's like clockwork with my family. If I'm not setting out condiments or refilling the cooler, I'm background noise to them. Ryan, of course, arrived late, but managed to become the center of attention within 5 minutes of stepping foot in the yard. He didn't help set up a single damn thing. He didn't lift a finger to carry a cooler, wipe down a table, or even offer to bring extra ice. But the moment he strutted in with his sunglasses and that fake warm smile, you'd think he'd just returned from curing cancer. He shook hands like a politician, kissed cheeks like a celebrity, and basked in the glow of my mother's over-the-top affection like it was his birthright. Meanwhile, I was hauling trays of deviled eggs and checking the propane tank on the grill, sweat running down my back, hair sticking to my neck, and still somehow managing to be invisible in my own family's backyard. I could see Mark across the yard, chatting casually with my uncle near the drinks table, blending in effortlessly, completely unaware of the twisted theater he'd just walked into. At least for now. The moment that made my stomach turn came not long after the second round of food hit the folding tables. People were sitting under the shade, laughing too loudly, and passing around a tray of brownies someone's wife brought, and that's when my mother decided it was time for her performance. She stood near the grill, wine glass in hand, eyes bright with that gleam she gets when she thinks she's being charming, but is actually just cruising for attention. She started talking about Ryan's latest investment property, a townhouse in a hot new area, as she put it, and went on about square footage, potential rental income, how he just has such a knack for these things. Everyone nodded and smiled, a few clapped, and I swear someone even whistled like he'd just won an award. I stood off to the side, arms crossed, chewing the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. But I tried, for once, to interject just a little. I mentioned that at work, we were about to launch a new project involving interdepartmental strategy implementation. The words were barely out of my mouth before my mother turned to me and said it. That one sentence, 7 seconds of air-shattering, soul-splitting humiliation, will live rent-free in my head for the rest of my life. Too bad you never amounted to anything, unlike your brother. Just like that. No hesitation. No smirk to soften the blow. Just raw, unfiltered dismissal in front of 24 people, half of whom I barely even know. There was a pause, a breathless beat of silence, and then someone laughed. I don't even know who it was. Maybe one of the cousins. Maybe one of the in-laws. But that sound, laughter at my expense, felt like it scraped across my skin. It wasn't even the words, not really. It was the ease with which she said them. The casual cruelty. Like it was a punchline she'd been waiting all day to deliver. I stood there, frozen, burger tongs in one hand, paper napkins in the other, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. My vision blurred a little, not with tears, but with heat, shame, and something colder underneath that I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was stunned. Numb. Hollowed out by the sheer force of how much I didn't matter to her. And here's the thing, this wasn't new. This wasn't even the worst she'd ever said. But something about that moment, that audience, that sheer indifference. Something in me snapped, quietly, invisibly, like a wire pulled too tight for too long, finally giving out with a soft, almost unnoticeable pop. Have you ever had someone humiliate you in front of everyone, pretending it was a joke? Did you just laugh it off, or did you finally snap? Tell me in the comments, because what happened next, I still replay in my head every single day. From across the yard, I caught a glimpse of Mark. His head had tilted slightly, like he wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Then came the slow raise of one eyebrow, that amused flicker behind his eyes, and he set his drink down on the table beside him. He started walking, calm and deliberate, straight toward my mother like a storm wrapped in a suit jacket. And right then, for the first time all day, I felt myself start to breathe again. There are certain moments in life when the air shifts in such a subtle but undeniable way that even the most oblivious people in the room can feel it in their bones, even if they can't quite explain why their shoulders tense or their voices suddenly drop to a hush. That moment came seconds after my mother's so-called joke, those 7 words she tossed out like a poisoned breadcrumb, still hanging in the air like the thick smoke curling from the grill. But something about the energy had changed, not in an explosive way. Not yet, but in that slow, deliberate hum of tension that always comes before a storm. Mark was already halfway across the yard by the time most people had finished laughing, that calm, effortless walk of someone who doesn't raise his voice because he knows people will listen regardless. His sleeves were rolled just past the elbows, his watch catching the light, and for a second, I thought maybe he was just coming to ask if I was all right. But the look on his face told me otherwise. He wasn't checking in, he was lining something up, and I wasn't sure if I should be scared or thrilled. He stopped just behind my mother's left shoulder, waited for the conversation to start trailing off again, and then, in the kind of casually deadly voice only certain people can pull off, said, "Interesting, since I just offered Claire a promotion. Over someone like your son, honestly." I swear, the silence that followed was louder than anything I'd heard that entire day. It hit the yard like a slap, sharp and fast, and for a second, I think even the birds stopped chirping. Ryan, who'd been mid-sip of his beer, choked slightly and lowered his glass with a slow, stunned motion like he'd just been told the world had tilted sideways. My mother didn't even speak right away. She just blinked at Mark like she hadn't heard him correctly, like her brain was trying to plug those words into an equation she couldn't solve. The pause was long enough to sting, and then Mark, without missing a beat, continued, "Claire's been running point on the new interdepartmental restructuring, budget oversight, analytics, cross-team collaboration, honestly. She's done the work of 3 people since February. I'm just the last one to officially catch up to it." Still, no one said anything. Not my cousins, not my aunts or uncles, not the neighbor who always talks too much about his lawn fertilizer. People shifted in their chairs, glanced at each other, unsure whether this was still part of the reunion or if they'd accidentally wandered into something private and explosive. And then Mark, because he has a way of twisting the knife without ever raising his voice, added, "Honestly, she outperformed some very aggressive male candidates, people we assumed were shoo-ins. But Claire's work ethic made it a no-brainer." Someone near the drink table let out a low whistle. A few murmurs rippled through the group. My mother's face tightened, and I watched it happen in real time, the way she tried to assemble a smile, tried to glue together the shattered pieces of whatever narrative she'd built around me over the years. You could see her reaching for something polite to say, some way to save face without acknowledging the slap in the ego that had just occurred. Ryan didn't say a word. His mouth was slightly open, like he wanted to argue, but he didn't know where to start. He looked at me then, for the first time in years really looked at me, not with that usual dismissive confidence, but with something bordering on confusion. Like he was trying to reconcile the image of me, his awkward, quiet, nothing special sister, with the version of me Mark had just laid bare for everyone to see. And I stood there quietly, still holding the damn tongs in one hand, not saying a word, not making a scene, not crowing about the promotion or rubbing it in. I didn't have to. The words were already out there, floating heavy in the air, heavier than any applause he'd ever received for selling some overpriced condo or flipping a backyard shed into a studio rental. Then someone clapped. Just once at first, a slow, deliberate clap from my Aunt Carol, of all people, and then another person joined in. It wasn't raucous applause, nothing dramatic, but it was just enough to let my mother know that the script had changed, that her favorite narrative had finally been interrupted by reality, and it wasn't going back to the way it was before. She tried to laugh, that brittle, too high laugh she uses when she's lost control of a room, and mumbled something about how she was just teasing, but her voice cracked halfway through it, and nobody laughed with her this time. I looked at Mark and nodded once, a silent thank you between two people who understood each other better than most. He didn't need to say another word. He just smiled that quiet smile of his and turned back toward the cooler like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just dismantled 20 years of family favoritism with one sentence and a calm stare. I didn't say anything either. I just wiped my hands on a napkin, set down the tongs, and walked across the yard, not fast, not smug, just steady, with my head high and my breath finally deep in my chest. I didn't need revenge, not really. That moment had been enough. But God, it was satisfying to watch their faces. The thing about people like Ryan is that they're not used to being surprised, especially not by the people they've spent a lifetime looking down on. They live in a world built on easy assumptions and louder voices, where confidence is mistaken for competence and a polished appearance can pass for substance, at least long enough to fool the people who only ever glance at the surface. So when that foundation cracks, when someone they've ignored suddenly steps out from behind the curtain and reveals they've been pulling the strings all along, it rattles them in a way that's almost pitiful to watch. He found me near the garage, maybe an hour after the whole scene with Mark had blown through the yard like a controlled demolition. People had gone back to chatting and laughing again, though the undertone had shifted, fewer glances at Ryan, more sideways looks at me, as if everyone was suddenly seeing me in a new light and wasn't quite sure how to make sense of it. But Ryan, bless his ego, hadn't moved on. Not even close. He came up fast, beer in hand, jaw tight with that forced casualness people use when they're seething but don't want to show it yet. So, he started, leaning against the fence like we were old friends catching up. You gonna tell me how the hell you pulled that off? I didn't answer right away. I didn't need to. The question hung in the air, full of resentment and disbelief, like he couldn't decide whether to accuse me of lying or congratulate me through gritted teeth. He expected me to laugh it off or downplay it, maybe even act surprised by the promotion myself, anything that would let him believe it was some kind of fluke. Instead, I looked him straight in the eye and said, I didn't pull anything off, Ryan. I earned it. Been doing the job for months before anyone officially handed me the title. He squinted at me, like the words didn't quite compute. Doing what, exactly? I mean, come on, what is it you even do over there? That question. That smug, dismissive question, served up like a joke but laced with venom, like he still couldn't imagine a version of reality where I was competent, let alone critical to anything important. I didn't rise to it. I just started listing things, calm and deliberate. Department analytics. Budget forecasting. Contract negotiation with third-party vendors. Streamlining cross-functional team deliverables. Strategic planning integration. You know, paperwork or something, I added, just sharp enough for him to hear the echo of Mom's voice in my tone. His face went stiff. He'd never once asked about my job before. Never cared to understand it, because in his world, if it doesn't have a sales pitch and a client dinner, it's not real work. But now the weight of those words was sinking in, slow and uncomfortable, dragging him down with them. And then came the twist I didn't expect. He muttered, almost under his breath, I actually tried applying at your company last year. I blinked. What? He shifted his weight awkwardly, eyes flicking down to the grass. Yeah. Thought I'd check out corporate roles. Sales department. Didn't get past the first interview round. I laughed before I could stop myself, not a cruel laugh, but one of those sharp, involuntary bursts that come when irony lands too perfectly to ignore. Well, maybe they saw through the polished resume, I said, trying to keep it light, but he didn't take it that way. It hit me then. This wasn't just about me outshining him at some backyard party. This was about the realization that I'd built something, earned something, quietly and consistently, while he'd coasted on charm and confidence and family favoritism. He wasn't smarter. He was just louder, and louder had always been enough in this family. And maybe, for the first time, he knew it too. I let the silence stretch between us for a moment before I added, casually, funny timing though. I might be hiring soon, team's expanding. But it's competitive, you know. Not everyone makes the cut. His head jerked up, eyes narrowing, searching for sarcasm. But I just shrugged and sipped my water like it wasn't meant as a jab. I didn't need to twist the knife. Just the idea of me being in a position to reject him was enough to make him squirm. And then, right on cue, my mother appeared again, this time not barking orders or laughing too loud, but with a softer posture, a wine glass in one hand and something unreadable in her expression. She didn't say anything at first, just stood a few feet away, watching us like she was trying to gauge the damage without admitting she'd helped cause it. There was still too much pride in her eyes, like she was already rewriting the narrative in her head to cast herself as a supportive mother who always believed in both her children equally. But the truth clung to the air between us like smoke from the grill, undeniable, heavy, and impossible to wave away. There are certain apologies that don't land like they're supposed to, not because the words themselves are wrong, but because they come wrapped in decades of denial, blame-shifting, and a tone that reeks more of saving face than seeking forgiveness. That's exactly how it felt when my mother finally cornered me after the crowd had thinned and the food trays had been picked over, the beer half flat, and the sun starting its slow descent behind the trees. She stood in the doorway to the kitchen with her shoulders pulled tight and her wine glass clutched too firmly in her hand, like she needed the liquid courage to spit out whatever half-formed excuse was burning her throat. "I didn't mean it like that," she said, voice brittle but rehearsed, as if saying it quickly and softly enough would somehow make the sting vanish. Like her words hadn't echoed across the backyard in front of 24 people and cracked something deep inside me that had been holding for far too long. I didn't respond right away because there wasn't anything to say, not at first, not without biting down the anger that had been sitting in my gut since childhood. She stepped closer, forcing a tight smile, one that barely reached her eyes, and added, "You know I was just joking, right? You've always taken things too seriously." That line, those exact words, have followed me my entire life. "You're too serious, too sensitive, too uptight." They were her shields, her way of invalidating anything that didn't fit her script, anything that made her uncomfortable enough to confront her own behavior. And I'd swallowed those words for years, pretending they didn't carve little wounds into my sense of self, pretending they didn't matter. But something in me cracked that day. Maybe it was Mark's presence or Ryan's stunned silence or simply the years of buried humiliation finally clawing their way to the surface, but I couldn't hold it back this time. I set down the dish I'd been drying and turned to her, my voice steadier than I expected, but colder than she'd probably ever heard it. "No," I said. "You didn't mean it as a joke. You meant it the way you always do, just polite enough to hide the blade, just public enough to make it sting deeper." Her face tightened, the smile faltering, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not anymore. "You never saw me, Mom. I wasn't invisible. I was just inconvenient. I didn't fit the picture you like to paint for everyone else, so you pushed me to the background and propped Ryan up like a goddamn trophy. And I let it happen. I kept showing up, hoping maybe one day you'd notice I wasn't just a shadow in a spotlight." She looked like she wanted to interrupt, maybe throw in another soft excuse, but I held up a hand to stop her, and to my surprise, she actually did. For once, she listened. Or maybe she was just stunned to hear me speak with that kind of fire in my voice. "He didn't need more attention," I continued. "He needed a babysitter. You gave him praise like it was oxygen and tossed me scraps like I should be grateful to even be at the table." Her eyes flicked away, down to her wine, then back to me again. "He struggled more than you think," she said quietly, like that explained everything. "He always needed more support." I almost laughed at the irony of it all. And I didn't? I needed a mother, not a critic. Not a measuring stick to hold me up against him every time I came home. You kept thinking he was the one who needed lifting, but it was me standing in the corner drowning quietly. There was a long silence then, thick, suffocating, heavy with years of things unsaid. I could see the words trying to form on her lips, the instinct to defend, to rationalize, to bury the discomfort under another passive comment. But instead, she just stood there, staring at me like she'd never really seen me before, like I'd stepped out of some alternate version of her daughter she'd never thought existed. "I'm not cutting you off," I finally said, softer now but no less firm. "I'm not going to stop coming around, not going to make some big dramatic exit from the family like you probably expect." Her shoulders eased slightly, but I wasn't finished. "But things are going to be different. You don't get to talk to me like that anymore and expect me to smile through it. You don't get to treat me like an afterthought and assume I'll just laugh it off to keep the peace." Her face flickered with something, maybe regret, maybe fear, maybe just the first twinges of understanding, but I didn't wait for her to respond. I walked past her, back into the kitchen, and started wrapping up the leftovers like nothing had happened, but inside, something monumental had shifted. I hadn't just spoken my truth, I'd reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd lost a long time ago. My voice, my space, my right to be seen. And I knew then that the next time she tried to rewrite the narrative, she'd have a much harder time convincing anyone that I was just the quiet one in the background. Because once a person finds their voice, they don't go back to silence. Not for anyone. There's a certain silence that comes with change, a different kind of quiet than the one I'd grown used to all my life. It wasn't the hollow quiet of being ignored or talked over or made to feel invisible. No, this quiet was heavier, steadier, the kind that settles into your bones when you realize the world didn't need to shift around you. You just needed to stop standing still in the middle of someone else's storm. The week after the reunion passed in a blur of motion and momentum, but beneath all of it was this calm, this internal stillness I hadn't known I'd been missing until it arrived. On Monday morning, I stepped into my new office, the one with my name printed clean and bold on the frosted glass door, Claire Hendricks, Team Lead, Strategic Operations. I stood there for a moment before going in, just letting myself take it in without brushing it off like I usually would, without diminishing it into something casual or unimportant. My inbox was already overflowing, the meetings stacked up in half-hour intervals, and my assistant had left a fresh packet of onboarding materials on my desk. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't pretending anymore. This was real, this was mine, and no one could take it from me with a single backhanded joke or dismissive laugh. Mark dropped by before noon, smiling that same quiet smile he always wore, and congratulated me again, not with fanfare, but with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that told me he saw the work, not just the title. And the team? They didn't hesitate. They'd already been coming to me for months, but now there was no need for subtlety. I was in charge, and it felt right in a way I hadn't expected. It didn't feel like revenge or validation. It felt like freedom. Like finally standing in my own damn skin without apology. It was late Wednesday afternoon when the call came in. I almost didn't answer because I didn't recognize the number, but something in me clicked when I saw the area code. I picked up, and sure enough, it was Ryan, his voice softer than usual, lacking that usual arrogance that seemed stitched into every word he spoke. For a second, I thought maybe he was calling to check in, maybe even to apologize in his own awkward way, but no, he got straight to the point. "So," he said, clearing his throat like he didn't want to admit what he was about to say, "I heard your department might be expanding. Any chance you'd recommend me for one of the client-facing roles?" I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling for a long second, letting the silence hang just long enough for him to start fidgeting on the other end of the line. He sounded desperate, not quite pleading, but close enough that I could hear the cracks in his usual confidence. I thought about all the years I'd spent watching him walk through doors that had been opened for him before he even knew they were there. I thought about the way he'd strutted through life with the wind always at his back, while I'd clawed my way through headwinds without complaint. Maybe I said finally, keeping my voice even, "If you take that Excel course you bombed last time." The pause on the line was thick enough to cut with a knife. He sputtered a half laugh, half scoff, but I didn't budge. I wasn't mocking him, I was just done making myself smaller to make him feel bigger. Funny how the tables turn, huh? I added, letting the words land gently but firmly. The quiet ones always remember. He didn't say much after that. We wrapped the call quickly, and I didn't offer any false warmth on the way out. I didn't need to. Whatever he'd been hoping to get from me, validation, help, maybe even pity, I wasn't offering it. Not anymore. That night, I sat on my back porch, the breeze cutting through the late summer air, and thought about everything that had unfolded in the past few weeks. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything, really. The promotion, the recognition, the moment at the reunion, it all mattered. Yes, but not in the way people probably thought. What mattered most was that I'd finally stopped pretending that being overlooked was normal, that staying silent was safer than speaking up. I didn't win anything. I just stopped playing the wrong game. But sometimes, just sometimes, I wonder if it was enough. Because there's still a part of me, buried somewhere beneath the calm and the resolve, that wishes my mother had meant that apology. That wishes my brother had truly seen me, not just reacted to the shift in power. That maybe, in another version of this life, I wouldn't have had to spend decades proving I deserved the seat I was already qualified to sit in. Still, I'll take the quiet over the noise. I'll take the peace over the performance. And I'll take the truth, raw and imperfect as it is, over any half-baked family fairy tale. Because when all the lights go out and the applause fades, the quiet ones always remember who they were before anyone else noticed. And now that I've remembered who I am, I'm not going back.